Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 35th week of 2014. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE is an acronym for the Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort, a local peace group. AWARE was formed shortly after the attacks of 9/11 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government was going to use those crimes as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. AWARE opposed the wars carried on by the Bush and Obama administrations and continued and expanded by the Obama administration at the moment. President Obama has shown himself willing to kill thousands of men, women, and children as a minion of the 1%, the American economic elite. The president's murders are certainly not in the interest of most Americans. Only those who want to maintain the American 1%'s control over the world economy, which they've enjoyed since the Second World War. To maintain that control, Washington uses its 1,000 military bases around the world and its special forces, which are essentially a president's private army, not controlled by Congress. Those special forces admit to being active in 124 countries around the world, and their activities include kidnapping, torture, and murder. Of course, the U.S. government and media call that rendition, enhanced interrogation, and disposition, which means murder decided by John Brennan's disposition matrix at the CIA. Obama himself is in fact more honest. Quotes, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," Obama said, after killing U.S. citizen Anwar al-Awlaki and his son in separate drone strikes in 2011. On Obama's orders, 5,000 people have been killed with drones, including 200 children. Right now, murders are being carried out by two client states of the U.S., Israel and Ukraine. Israel has massacred more than 2,000 people in Gaza, mostly civilians, and the U.S.-backed and installed government in Kiev has killed just as many in eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region. And its war has resulted in the destruction of a commercial airliner that killed 298 men, women, and children. Who is finally responsible for mass murder in Gaza and Donbas? Their leaders can be blamed for Israel and Ukraine's committing what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime, that is worse than terrorism, waging aggressive war. But the final responsibility lies with the president. Without the support, economic, military, political, and diplomatic, that the U.S. government provides, Israel's crimes would not be possible, and neither would the coup and the military assaults by the Ukrainian government. President Obama fails to stop Israel's ongoing murders in Gaza, as he could, with the word, because it's been the policy of all U.S. administrations for 2 generations to allow the Israelis to continue their oppression of the Palestinians so long as Israel acts as a stationary aircraft carrier for U.S. control of Mideast gas and oil. In Eastern Europe, the U.S. immediately violated its promise not to extend NATO to the borders of Russia and is now scheming to do so through Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. President Obama's administration engineered the coup against an elected government in Ukraine and sent the CIA chief, the infamous Brennan, to encourage a Ukrainian army attack on the regions that resisted the new government, the first government in Europe since World War II to include fascist parties. It's time to say no to the child killer in the White House and the murderous government whom he supports, including murderous police forces in the U.S., who kill hundreds of citizens each year, while police forces in England and Germany kill none. We have to ask, whose interest does the U.S. government killing serve? The American people do not profit from these murders, nor do they enhance our security. Just the opposite. They're bringing us the hatred of the world for the profit of the 1%. We'll examine some aspects of this question tonight with comments from Karen Evans-Levy, Ron Zook, Yakov Ziso, and we'll begin with Ron Zook on a plethora of pretexts.
Yes, I want to comment on some of the things that are being said in justification for the bombing, shooting, burning, killing that's going on in various places. And we're given to understand always that people are doing this for the very highest and holiest of motives. In the case of the USA, we're trying to bring freedom, democracy, and human rights to those people. We're going to impose it on them, whether our versions of those things, whether they like it or not, it appears. And to comment again, as I did some time ago when I first came on this program, about some of the fallacies and sophisms that are prevalent in the media and public discussion about these matters. A plethora of pretexts refers to the pretexts and cover stories and justifications, excuses that are being offered for doing whatever we do, resulting in a enormous swath of corpses and rubbles across the Middle East, especially. But I'll point to the most recent one coming out of Israel. They run a remarkably disciplined and it seems well rewarded PR and propaganda operation. And I'll have some more to say about that a little later. The latest one is an old standard. It's a classic, actually, in war situations, the captured documents. They claim to have captured a Hamas training manual and to be exhibiting a supposed page from it telling the Hamas militants to use human shields in their warfare. It's never been actually documented that this has ever actually been done, but by Hamas. These are like the claims that are the accusations that are circulated by one side against the other, but that seems to have little meaning to a lot of people. There are a lot of things that sound clever to some people and maybe even convincing to them that are being offered. The standard, of course, the routine, is the traffic and atrocity stories. One side telling the world about the horrors, the utter, absolute, shrieking, freaking horrors committed by the other side. And that goes on, back and forth. And the enemies of America have picked up on this, the American style of using pretexts and cover stories, and are doing some of it themselves. Interesting article recently about complaining about the other countries availing themselves to the rhetoric about terrorists. And here it is from the New York Times by Robert Mackey on August 19th. Russia, Iran, and Egypt heckle the U.S. about tactics in Ferguson. This is about other countries picking up on the treatment of the black people in Ferguson, Missouri, and asking, in effect, what about all of your fine talk about freedom, democracy, and human rights in the case of Ferguson, Missouri? So this article kind of ridicules this by saying that, quoting, while urging other countries to guarantee the freedom of speech and not to suppress anti-government protests, the United States authorities at home are not too soft with those actively expressing discontent over persistent inequalities, actual discrimination, and the situation of second-class citizens, Mr. Dolgov said, who's the Russian Foreign Ministry's Commissioner for Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. So they can use that rhetoric, too, to justify whatever they're doing. Extreme mayhem has become a major focus of the Kremlin-funded news network Russia Today, or RT, which targets viewers abroad Notice that the verb to target has become indispensable in political discussion today. So we'll find out later. Well, you can guess who I'm targeting, and we'll see. Who are you targeting today, Karen or Carl?
It's a target-rich environment,
Yes.
as they say.
Targets viewers abroad through broadcasts in English, Spanish, and Arabic that often highlight America's shortcomings with a neo-Soviet zeal. Aha! There's the key. This week, RT's main English language channel featured regular updates from the war zone by its correspondent, Anastasia Churkina, a daughter of Russia's United Nations ambassador, Vitaly Churkina. RT's news agency, Rupley, has filled its YouTube channel with live streams from Ferguson, raw footage of tear gas victims, and a drone's eye view of protesters near a looted and torched gas station. So this article then quotes a Russian-American writer who's critiquing this. She points out that officials in Moscow have long relied on discussions of racial inequality in the United States to counter criticism of their own human rights abuses. The now sacred Russian tactic of whataboutism started with civil rights. Miss Ioffe wrote, whenever the U.S. pointed to Soviet human rights violations, the Soviets had an easy riposte. Well, they said, lynch Negroes. So it's coming back, the same line, and it's heard over and over again. This has become absolutely standard, routine reply to anything. Anytime an accusation is being made about what someone is doing and criticizing, it's instant, automatic, completely mindless. You too, you're another. This is a classic fallacy, the tu quoque. You too, you're another. You terrible hypocrite. You're doing just what you're criticizing us for. And this leads on into a ever-lengthening list of these fallacies. Note that this has absolutely no validity. If I criticize you for committing some crime or doing something immoral, and you come back at me for doing the same thing, that may or may not be true, but it's completely irrelevant. So if that's going to be your excuse, your cover story for doing whatever you do by accusing me of doing the same thing, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. It has no validity. But even if it's completely true, but there's a deep feeling in a lot of people that if I criticize you for doing something that I'm doing myself, that invalidates the criticism of you. And it's just not true. That's a separate issue. So look for whataboutism. It's in heavy use today when the atrocity stories are being traded. The attempt to establish what's called moral equivalence. What you're doing is just as bad, and so you have no basis on which to criticize us. You too, you're another, you hypocrite. And then after the criticism is made, the line will start, well, what about this? Well, what about that? And then the whole repertoire of atrocity stories will then begin to be unpacked. So back and forth it goes endlessly, and it's all so completely futile. So if you want to trade in atrocity stories, I'm not going to be impressed, I think. Interesting note in the American Conservative on Israel's information ops, one of the best organized, by the way, and best rewarded efforts in the whole international PR and propaganda field. There's a paragraph in here about the Hasbara, not sure how to pronounce that, effort, project, how to identify them. Actually, there are college students in the 7 universities in Israel who are being paid up to $2,000 a month to monitor the internet and to instantly counter everything that appears anti-Israel or is critical of the operations of the IDF as they continue to kill and destroy in Gaza. The Hasbara comments are noticeable as they tend to sound like boilerplate and run contrary to or even ignore what the other contributors to the site are writing. They often include spelling and syntactical hints that the writer is not natively fluent in English, as is the practice in corporate customer support call centers in Asia. The commenters generally go by American-sounding names, and they never indicate that they are Israelis or working on behalf of the Israeli government. They tend to repeat over and over again sound bites of pseudo-information, most recently maintaining falsely that Hamas had started the war and that Israel was only defending itself. The commenters operate in the belief that if something's repeated often enough in many different places, it will ipso facto gain some credibility and create doubts regarding contrary points of view. This has been noticed by some commentators on the internet before. If you say something, the magic number seems to be 5. If you say something 5 times, a number of people will start to believe it. After all, naive people will think they couldn't keep saying that if it weren't true, at least to some extent.
That's up from Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah,
What I tell
right.
you 3 times is
Yeah,
true,
yeah,
right?
right.
So if we repeat things 5 times, then people will start believing us. I
Yeah,
like
right,
that.
right. So it's very
Don't believe us. either.
disappointing and disillusioning to me that people tend
Check
to
that.
think by association rather than inference. And rather than thinking about what's a reasonable and valid and justified inference with some backing of empirical evidence or logical argument, they will tend to associate things. So you just have to establish the association in people's minds, and when you say A, they will think of B, and this turns out to be a form of classical conditioning. You ring the bell, and people will salivate fear and hatred, especially the word socialism, for example, will set this off. Oh my God, socialism, how horrible. But I'll come back to this theme because it's a persistent one and one that I've been thinking about for years. I've never been successful so far in organizing all the fallacies and sophisms that are coming at us constantly in public discussion and the media. And maybe that'll never get done because there's so many of them, and some of them are so ingenious and sound so clever to some people that this may turn out to be impossible for me anyway. So there's a big area for inquiry and discussion there, I think. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. Panel, what about that, so to say,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
to speak?
Yeah.
Comments?
Can I go first?
Sure. Comments on what Ron's just said? We'll give you a chance on something else later if you want.
No, I mean, I have comments. I just want Karen
Oh,
to
yeah,
go first.
sure.
It's closely related to the issues that are happening on the university campus right now, where the university rescinded the job. What do you call it? They offered a job to a new faculty member. He accepted it, moved down here, and then the university retracted the job offer, and because of a few tweets that they read and misread, and so the university says that he is being. He did some things that were very controversial, but then they do something that's that I'm not speaking very well. Yaakov, you should say it, and then I'll come back to it because it has to do with the issue that I'm going to bring up later.
They said that he was controversial, and they essentially basically
non-civil.
broke the law, the state, our state, and also the federal law about freedom of speech.
Right, and then they violated his freedom of speech. Exactly right.
That was just by. They justified their act by essentially doing something against the law.
That's right. That's right. But so my point is that Ron is correct that, okay, when someone says you committed a crime and then the person says back to you, well, you committed this crime, and they're really not related. In this case, it really is related, because if someone says that someone was being uncivil, the university's actions were also uncivil. So when it is actually related to the actual thing that is happening right then, and it's not pointing to a different crime or a different, but their action is also an uncivil, violent, in this case it wasn't violent, but it was definitely an uncivil and prejudicial and just because someone disagreed with their opinions, then they fired him basically without ever letting him even settle in.
Yeah, well, basically because he has a bad attitude, apparently.
Well, I think that it's more than just that just attitude. He did Twitter and created a few texts that are not in line with what the university would like to have out there for commercial reasons. At the same time, I personally, being a graduate of the university, having worked for the university until 4 months ago, I'm scared. I'm really scared of what's happening in our community.
Yeah.
There is a famous anecdote of 2 judges going through a red light, and then they say, well, let's just not go through all the red tape of going through court. Let's just judge each other. So the first one comes and says, I went through red light. So the other one says, okay, I'll just give you a warning. Then the second one comes and says the same thing, and the first one tells him, well, this is going to be a fine of $1,000. He said, why? He says, well, you are the second case today. So in our community, this is unfortunately not funny. After Kilgore, the same person, the same Kennedy, is openly quoting something that is against the law, against the very fiber of our community, is doing something, and the provost completely backs that up. This is, like I said, this is really scary. If I were, I'm not. If I were a faculty applying for a job, coming to work here, the repercussions are completely devastating. What it makes our faculty, the non-tenured. The tenured probably are going to be as fascists as they want, but the non-tenured are going to be now in a very sensible situation of they have to put up with this kind of anti-democratic behavior.
So the News Gazette actually published a paper, a letter that was sent to the university, and I think the only reason that the News Gazette published it was because it was actually submitted by 64 tenured University of Illinois professors. And in this letter it says, had this process taken its course, he would have begun work, the hiring process. Had this process taken its course, he would have begun work on August 16th, several weeks before the formal approval of the University of Illinois Board of Trustees at their September meeting. Salita resigned his previous position, rented a house in Champaign, and prepared to join a faculty that had over a year to scrutinize his credentials. The withdrawal of the offer just days before the expected start date was made without the knowledge of the department leaders and deans most familiar with the details of the case. And then it goes on. Their reference is to a small number of tweets that were first publicized and described as anti-Semitic on a pro-Israel conservative blog. In tweets from the same period, Salito himself refused to conceptualize Israel-Palestine as Jewish-Arab acrimony, and he declared his solidarity with many Jews and wrote, "It's a beautiful thing to see our Jewish brothers and sisters around the world deploring Israel's brutality in Gaza." So he wasn't like pushing all Jews in one place. He was talking about the situation of Israel and Gaza. Okay. Later on it says, according to Berbalais, and Tolliver, however, Salida's comments on social media as a private citizen preclude any possibility of dialogue, disagreement, or reasoned examination. Yet, anyone familiar with the actual stream of tweets would recognize that they created dialogue. Salida's record of highly reputed research and excellent teaching is not and has never been in dispute. It is rather the decision to rescind Salida's offer in this arbitrary manner which has precluded debate. But the decision has done much more than that. It has also severely damaged the reputation of the University of Illinois, which now appears intolerant of political speech as well as indifferent to its own principles of due process, shared governance, and academic freedom. Unsurprisingly, thousands of distinguished scholars from all over the world and venerable professional organizations such as the Center for Constitutional Rights and the Modern Language Association have written to the Chancellor in protest. Many have promised to boycott the university until the decision is reversed. This is a great letter, and this was signed by only 64 tenured university professors. That's a lot, but I mean, there's several other letters that were read today at a demonstration in front of the Swanland Administration Building. There were approximately 80 people there when I was there. It was very hot outside. We were having to stand in the sun.
And this was primarily a student demonstration, right?
It was a student demonstration mostly. There were a couple non-student people there. I was a community member there. And then there were 4 or 5 different letters from different groups that were read, and all of them are were signed by multiple people, not just one person, but groups of people saying that the university has really made a mistake in this issue, and not just with Salida, but also James Kilgore, as you had mentioned, that academic freedom is still vital to the university and to the community at large. And it was really good. I will mention that the Gender and Women's Studies will host an open discussion section about the concept of academic freedom. What does it mean to be free and who decides? And the practice of political dissent at this moment out in the street. What's your tweet? So they will have that on September 5th from noon to 3 p.m. And that's, I think they said it was going to be at the Gender and Women's Studies at 1205 West Nevada Street. So we look forward to more discussion on the issue and more discussion and academic freedom in the future.
I'd like to add to what I said before about not only what faculty are going to say or how they are going to view what is happening with Salida, but I would like to look at I think the most important group here are the students. What are we telling our students?
Right.
We are telling our students that yes, I would like very much to say something to our students. We are telling them that at 18 years old, you are kosher to go to Iraq and kill. You are kosher to go all over wherever we sent you and use our weapons to kill other people, but you are not old or mature enough to defend yourself when you participate in a discussion where there are disagreements. That's what we are telling them. You are basically morons. We are telling them you are not fit to participate in a class or in a discussion where someone is going to have controversial issues. That's what we are telling them. We are telling them, we are going to choose the demagogues for you. You are not yet able to deal with them, and you are not even going to be able to recognize them because we will recognize them before you. That's what people come to the university. This is completely the main reason that one goes to the university.
Yeah.
Yep.
What you're actually hearing in a number of places is more whataboutism. What about the feelings of those Jewish and Israeli students who will be offended if they're in the class of this professor that they think has anti-Israel or anti-Jewish or anti-Zionist views. What about their feelings?
But what about the Palestinians that are hurt by the...
What about this?
Right.
What about that?
Right. So we should go back to the real issue of it should actually be...
It's higher education. This is the issue. It's higher education. Yeah. People are supposed to get something here they are not getting in the kindergarten or in their families' Thanksgiving dinners. Right. They come here to learn something they didn't experience before, not to be exposed to some kind of a line of agreement with going to wars all over the world.
Yeah.
But there's, I mean, the issue of academic freedom is also that you can, that a professor can and should be able to say anything he wants in the public sphere or private and not be, and if it's his own opinion, he should state it as his own opinion or her opinion, and not be disciplined or fired for doing so.
Yeah, well, we've had many cases like this. Our history professor who was criticized, I'm not sure he eventually got fired, for showing slides of nudes.
But that's in a class.
Yeah, in an art history class.
Well, yeah, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
And what about the feelings of those fundamentalist students who are taught that Darwinian evolution is true? Shouldn't we at least give equal time to the biblical story in Genesis and so on? What about the chemistry students who are not told about the validity of alchemy? Or what about the flat earthers and their feelings and so on? That's what it's degenerated into.
You're going to be really upset, Ron, when they actually transmute something into gold, you know, on an industrial basis.
Yeah,
here.
What about that? Right.
You're watching Aware on the Air, where we are discussing some fairly local problems that have some a great deal more than local significance. We're talking about the case at the University of Illinois of the withdrawal of a job offer to a professor who apparently was unpleasant about Israel. There are two...
It wasn't about Israel. It was about the operations of the IDF. And those are...
That's exactly true. Yeah. And he was saying that there are a lot of Israelis who are on, you know...
Exactly.
Exactly. So.
I see.
Yes, good point, though.
It seems to me there are 2 points that... in fact, separable points about this matter. One is the egregious violation of academic freedom.
Yes.
And that, as a couple of the panelists have pointed out, has a great history. A history, indeed, that runs back for the throughout the 20th century, from the First World War through the Vietnam War, of universities proclaiming academic freedom and then immediately silencing people with the wrong political views. That's nothing new. It is a little embarrassing to see the University of Illinois so avidly imitate this tradition of violations of academic freedom for political purposes. The second point, though, is that this particular case does seem to be bound up with the circumstances Ron was talking about earlier, the way in which the government of Israel and its apologists in this country, the so-called Israel lobby, have been very active about making sure that people not be unpleasant about Israel on college campuses and in university faculties. The particular case that we're talking about today, about which the demonstration on campus occurred, case involving Stephen Salita, was apparently brought forward largely by a member of the English faculty here, Carrie Nelson, who was at one point head of the American Association of University Professors and author of a book describing himself as a tenured radical. He was critical of policies of American universities, particularly those that involved free speech. But when it came down to this particular issue, Kerry seems to have been greatly influenced by a number of pro-Israel groups in this country that have been trying to make sure that criticism of Israel's politics, and particularly, as Ron points out, of the IDF, Israel's armed forces, those critics not be given a voice on American college campuses, whether they're students in the so-called boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, or in the particular case here, a professor of, in this case, American Indian Studies. So they're active, they're working hard on it. Hasbara, propaganda, the presentation of a tendentious case for Israel's crimes in Gaza particularly, has been an active activity, has been present in to a great extent on American universities this summer for obvious reasons, and they seem to have landed here particularly at the little university down the street. So
Can I comment
an important issue.
So first of all, I wanted to say, Carl, the IDF stands for Israel Defense Forces.
Right.
This name became obsolete in 1982 when the Israeli army offensed the Beirut and since. And that was a comment made within the Israeli army. I pointed out about it last time when I spoke about the...
What's it called now?
It's still called
It
the
They
depends.
IDF.
still call that.
I call it Israeli Occupation Army.
Right, right.
People call it different names, but it's never. It's even though it's officially Israel Defense Forces,
Right.
it's not.
Okay.
Right.
And then I wanted to tell also another comment about what you said, Carl. You said that over 2,000 people were killed, Palestinians were killed. I don't know. I mean, we are kind of, it's media-driven accountancy of the victims of the occupation. The occupation started many years ago, and there are scores of thousands of people who were killed and who are essentially are the very victims and the very results of the occupation. So 2,000 is just the late number that shows
of
in the newspaper.
recent thing. Yeah.
So
Recent.
another thing that I wanted to say is that I thought this week the most hilarious comment I read was that someone in the Russian parliament, in the Duma, made the following comment. He said, he called for international intervention in Ferguson. I thought this was hilarious. This was just the right. This is a sense of humor that we don't have here, and we really need to enter. This is exactly the comment to make to our great forefathers in the government.
Yes.
I have a few comments also about, so Ron, you mentioned that the thing with the human shields have not been documented. Unfortunately, or just accurately, there are several clips and there are several interviews, and even 2 days ago there are people from the Hamas leadership who said that they did train and called for using mosques and schools as places from where they are going to launch the rockets. So this is like a tactic that we discussed or addressed in from different angles. But I don't think that the issue is whether things are documented or not. I think that the issue is the fact that people are shooting at each other now, or if they shot at each other in 2006, is a result of something much bigger that we don't address.
Right.
In the same vein, I would like to repeat something that I've said a few meetings ago. By the way, Ron, today is my meeting number 5. So this is the 5th time that I hear you saying. So we never discussed here on this panel, not only, we didn't discuss about the spirit of Islam. There are all those people who have been killed because of something having to do with the spirit of Islam. And I'm not talking only about ISIS in Iraq and Syria.
Right.
I'm talking about Darfur. I'm talking about Nigeria. There is something having to do with Islam which we don't criticize. I think that not only criticize, but we are not studying enough to know how to address these people and what can we do about what they do. One of the things that that comes up all the time is the fact that we don't do it. And I think that I know what the reason is. One of the reasons is, the main reason is that there is a very strong propaganda that's being essentially sponsored by Qatar. And that is a propaganda that has a certain tactics and a certain goals that are being achieved. And when people do not dare go into criticizing Islam, they think they're going to do a damage to Islam by criticizing Islam, or what I call not Islam, but the spirit of Islam. I don't think so. If we're talking like the Salata thing, we're talking about free speech. I think it is our responsibility to engage in as many discussions about things that are so critical about our lives. And let's listen to each other about it.
Okay, so I want to take a criticism toward Christianity. I want to criticize Christians for allowing, in particular, the Lutheran Church in Germany for not standing up against Hitler when Hitler was doing the stuff he was doing. So,
Did two
Christianity.
Coca just
No.
raise its head, Ron?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just saying.
What
that-
about this? And what about this?
I'm just saying that if you to criticize Christianity, there are so many different levels of Christianity, and there are so many different types of Christianity, and there's so many different ways that people are Christian. To criticize Islam, there are so many different levels, types, ways it's used, ways that it's implemented in the government and not implemented in government. There are ways that Christianity is used in government and not used in government. There are ways that are done in that are done in the name of God that on any religion, and I'm not sure that religion has anything to do with it. That you should actually leave that aside and do what governments are doing to people and what people are doing to people, and treat them as that rather than as religions doing it to people and doing it in the name of religion.
I fully agree with you that it's not a matter of criticizing. It's a matter of, first of all, learning. In order to criticize or to critique or to discuss with something, we have to first learn what that is. So that's the first step, learning what that is, and then seeing how it operates. The way that Carl, for example, presents what we are doing in the Middle East, it's in a certain context. We know from what he says what are the forces, what are the ideas, the principles that operate there, so that the military complex is going to get what they want. We have a context. We do not have, I should say, yet a context for Islam. I'm just inviting that study so we know more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think another factor is that we have some hope of influencing Israel or some part of Israel, and we have almost none of influencing the Muslim Arab people in the Middle East.
No, that's
I don't see how we could be effective there. Well, the Israelis constantly pretend to be exactly the same
But it's not because of the religion.
as the USA in their policies and aspirations and so on.
I want to say, though, Ron, that it seems to me that we make a mistake in analysis when we make that sort of distinction between America's allies in the Middle East, in Israel, and America's allies in Islam. The suggestion, which we never get from the government itself, but we certainly get from its propaganda covers in the media, that the U.S. is fighting Islamic terrorism in the Middle East, is simply false when we look at what the U.S. is actually doing for allies and clients in the Middle East. The U.S. has at the moment two principal allies, two principal clients in the Middle East. One is the State of Israel, and the other is Saudi Arabia. American policy rests upon an essential alliance between the Saudis and Israel. Now, Yaakov has mentioned here Qatar, which is an uncomfortable ally of the first two. And the ideology that is emanating from Saudi Arabia and Qatar in other parts of the Middle East that is having quite a remarkable blowback effect at the moment. Wahhabism, the form of Islam that Saudi Arabia sponsors, indeed that Saudi Arabia brought to life, is a sort of, for lack of a better term, a fundamentalist Islam that has been associated with jihadism, that is, religious war. Now look, we need to look at where both jihadism and Wahhabism in the Middle East come from right now. The jihadist tradition was invented by the United States in the 1970s when the Carter administration got together the most fanatical religious extremists it could find and sent them gave them money, gave them arms in the most expensive CIA operation in history, and sent them into Afghanistan in order to ignore the Russians. Annoy is too weak a word. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the American National Security Advisor, said that the plan was to give Russia a Vietnam of its own. Now, this was before the invasion of Russia, and one might say that the Brzezinski plan, the Carter plan, succeeded in that Russia did invade Afghanistan because of the attacks on Russia that were coming from these jihadi, that is to say, religious extremist fighters from Afghanistan. Now, this tradition continues, and it continues with this sort of extremist Islamist authoritarianism, fundamentalism, spreading in various places in the Middle East, most notably in the so-called caliphate that's emerged in these last months. I recommend Patrick Coburn's new book. Patrick Coburn has been writing sense about these matters for British papers for a generation, practically. He has a new book called The Jihadi's Return, ISIS and the New Sunni Uprising, in which he gives a background of how it is that this militant Islam in the Wahhabi form has got an incarnation in a political movement that has now conquered half of Iraq and half of Syria. The U.S. is concerned about this. Lights are burning late in Foggy Bottom, where the State Department is right now, as the U.S. decides to the extent to which it will increase its military activities in the Middle East, not begin them, increase its military activities in the Middle East in order to maintain what it's always been interested in, a general control of the region in order to retain its economy. There are wheels within wheels here. IS, originally sponsored by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, is acting pretty independently of them right now, and many people, including Patrick Coburn, suggest that Saudi Arabia is particularly afraid of its creation because it's afraid that the final blowback will be directed against Saudi Arabia and possibly even Qatar. Against Saudi Arabia, and possibly Qatar is even how shall I put it, acquiescent in that possibility. So I think Yaakov is quite right that we need to look at the ideological constructs in the Middle East, but we have to look at them once we've stripped away the American propaganda account that we get universally throughout the American media, and try to understand what the various parties, particularly the parties that are allies or clients of the United States, are actually doing in the region. It's pretty different from what the U.S. suggests.
I think that both what you are saying and I'm saying is an attempt to not be cynical. We have to look at the reality. 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 We essentially what we are talking about is a bird's view of what is happening beyond naming it ISIS, Syria, Libya, Qatar. We are looking at, I think that what we are looking at is the very room of an accountant or the resource manager of some military complex deciding where can we now go and sell our weapons for as long as possible.
Certainly part of it.
And then they look at what are the forces operating in that region, how they can manipulate it so that they will operate as long as possible, and then they're going to have return customers.
Yep.
You mentioned a moment ago, Yakov, the ambiguities, to put no finer point on it, of the word defense when it's used in this area, how, in fact, inaccurate it is to talk about the Israeli defense forces. We're used to that. I mean, we talk about a defense department in this country, and we changed the name, actually, from the War Department to Defense Department after the Second World War, because it was clear what the U.S. had to cover over, the fact that it was promoting war and had to call it defense. The defense industries are perhaps the even more egregious example of this sort of euphemism. Defense industries are arms merchants, as you say,
Right.
and arms merchants are notoriously willing to sell to the highest bidder.
So we should call it the offense instead of the defense.
The Offense Department, I think, would be a
Department,
far
and-
more accurate description of what the U.S. has done for 50
I like it.
years.
I like it.
And to call them offensive industries would be true not only as a description, but as a
Yep.
moral judgment, I think.
I'm with it.
Let me return to my point that it seems to me more appropriate to criticize the military operations of Israel at this point than those of the Arab states, because Israel keeps making all these pretensions to democracy and human rights and so on, insisting that their ideals and policies are completely synonymous and coextensive with those of the USA. And I think that opens them up to the charge of that not being true. Whereas the Arabs make fewer pretensions in that direction, I think.
Well, the reason that I feel comfortable being critical of Israel is because the United States' direct support of what
Yes,
Israel
exactly.
does.
Yes, that too.
I think that what Ron is saying is that since they say we Israelis are a democracy, then Ron says, then let's take you up.
Yeah.
If you want to speak the same language or a common language, then let's talk that language. Unlike if you were to speak with Assad, then there's no common language there.
Yeah, yeah.
The only thing I would say was that it's important for us as Americans to examine what the American government is doing. The U.S. government is really only afraid of one enemy, and it's not Israel and it's not Saudi Arabia. The U.S. government is afraid of the American populace. And what it has suffered from, what's driven presidents from office, for example, in living memory, is Americans finally rejecting what the American government is doing once they've come to understand what it is actually doing over against the propaganda account that we get from the American media. Our task here is to try to break through that propaganda account and give an account of what the government for which we're responsible. After all, you know, having the franchise, being able to vote, means that we are in some sense responsible for the outcome of that vote. What we need to do is to see what the government for which we're responsible is actually doing and what they're indeed trying to hide from us, because it's only us that they're afraid of. So to understand what the U.S. is doing in the Middle East, how the U.S. is actually behaving, is the fundamental task here. It's a happy accident, perhaps, that our group is named from an acronym, AWARE, but certainly our point is that people should become aware over against strong attempts to prevent understanding, should become aware of what our government is doing, particularly in the Middle East and particularly, of course, in regard to killing people.
Hand on the heart. I mean, mano to mano. Do you really think that we are responsible for our government, or is it just a game?
Well, there are many people who will say we're getting the government we deserve.
Well, yeah, and
What do you think? Thanks, Ron.
Neither is true, of course, in that we're not responsible for our government, in that we have not done anything more than allow ourselves to be misled into sponsoring policies that actually benefit other people. It isn't the case that we sat around and decided as a people, yes, we want to kill people throughout the Middle East so that a few folks in New York can profit. We have not done that, and in that sense, we're not responsible for it. We are responsible for it to the extent that we have allowed ourselves to be misled about what our government is actually doing.
And
I learned my question from you. I remember the very days when Obama was running in 2008. And you were the only one to point out that about the drones in 2008 and 12, and and they lived happily ever after. You were the only one pointing out that, wait a second, this is what's happening in Iraq.
Yeah.
This is the butchering that's happening there, and in Yemen. I mean, we still have those emails from you. At the same time, we got an Afro-American president. We were so ecstatic, and we forgot that back to the range, people are being now massacred all over the Middle East and elsewhere.
This raises a delicate point in democratic theory, I think, about the extent to which we are responsible for and complicit in the actions, the decisions of our officials who have been voted into office. And even if, did we participate in the political process at all? Did we vote for them? Those that we didn't vote for, and so on. Have we given our tacit consent to whatever they do, and so on? It becomes very messy. The extent to which you and I personally are responsible for the actions of Barack Obama, for example.
But
if you continue to live in this country,
but a democracy depends on people educating themselves, knowing what's going on, and then telling their elected representatives what should be happening.
Yeah.
As long as they do not stand up, as long as they do not educate themselves, then democracy is whatever we pay for.
The messier, the better. The only thing that needs to be clear is whether the checks paying for the arms were clear or not. But really, back to you, Karen, I think that it is really our responsibility to, when we make those signs for the protest, when we say anti-war, it's that moment when we need to put something there that is going to address exactly what we need to take responsibility over.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 35th week of 2014. Thanks to Jason Liggett for direction and production. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans often don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. We've had requests this week to participate in Aware's anti-war demonstrations, which are held the first Saturday of every month in downtown Champaign, corner of Main and Neal Streets, from 2 to 4 p.m. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, David Green, Yaakov Ziso, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.